Okay.
Laura, shall I wait for you? Hi, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here on a especially extraordinarily hot day. Can you not hear? Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. I just want to welcome you all. Thank you so much for coming today. And I know it's really hot and it's a Sunday afternoon, but this is an important subject, and the fact that you're here means that you know it is too. And we're so fortunate to have amazing panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I'm going to start with Sarah. But first I want to say that what we're going to do is showcase actions that businesses, philanthropic, and policy leaders are taking to advance voter information, participation, representation, and other things. And I want to welcome our expert panel, Dan Sells, Gauri Chandran, I'm sorry, and Joy Oseanto, who will share information about their organizations and answer questions prepared by our moderator, Sarah Vacchiano. Sarah will then take question and answers from the audience because we have an amazing representation from so many groups here that I want you also to be able to have the opportunity to introduce yourselves and what you're doing, because the reason that we're doing all this is to share resources from all these different sectors that are represented, and the fact that you've shown up today. And anyway, so there will be plenty of time for question and answer, that you can keep it very brief and talk about what you're doing and how it relates, and Sarah will be managing all of that. So that we can all have more actions and impact from our actions. Then following, there's more reception. So now to our experts. Sarah Vacchiano is an entertainment lawyer, writer, and founder of Civic EQ, which is a Substack focused on empowering parents to be more confident in their civic knowledge so that they can raise curious and civically engaged kids. Renee, you can put her slide on too. Her passion is finding ways to help parents and kids see civics differently. And Sarah will introduce the panelists. So thank you so much, and I will be back shortly.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's such a pleasure for me to be here today with Gauri, Joy, and Dan, and Civicas. Thank you to Cynthia specifically and the whole Civicas team for bringing us here together in this beautiful air-conditioned room. When we first started brainstorming today's discussion at the beginning of the summer, the energy around words like democracy and civics and elections was very, very different than it is now. It's been 49 days, unbelievably, since President Biden stepped down as the Democratic nominee. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that the last 7 weeks has actually felt like the beginning of a political renaissance in many ways. We're now 57 days away from an election that many consider to be the most important election of our lifetime, and it's probably true. But what's equally true is that America has faced significant challenges before, and not only have we survived, we've thrived. In 2 years, America will celebrate its 250th year as a democratic republic, the longest standing democracy in history. I'm not quite sure what panels will look like when it turns 500, but I do think that our democracy will still be going strong, and a model that continues to inspire other nations. My hope is that each of us comes away today with a renewed belief that the sum of us is greater than our parts. We've curated the panel today to cover timely issues that all underscore the idea that democracy is larger than politics, because that belief is foundational to the pro-democracy movement that we're all taking part in, starting today. Over the next hour, we're going to cover things like election security and ways to protect against the worst and harness the best of AI, discuss new ways to reimagine civic education, and gain insight from how business leaders are changing the landscape of democracy reform. Democracy is a long game. Presidential elections shape the contours of who we are as a country, and they are monumental in many ways. But so much of the important work is done in between, behind the scenes by people like you and me who show up on a Sunday afternoon with the hope that we can learn just a little bit more than we knew when we woke up this morning. Thank you so much for being part of Democracy 2024 and American Renaissance. And now I'm pleased to introduce our first panelist, Joy Oceanto. Joy is Managing Director of Funder Engagement for Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. Joy, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon.
So happy to be here, Sarah. You all, thanks for being here. I'm so happy that none of you melted on the way in. I work for PACE. PACE is a philanthropic laboratory. We are a philanthropy serving organization, which means that we are a member-based organization for foundations to come together to engage in experiments and learning and increase practice and impact. Our membership includes foundations of all sizes and orientations. We've got private foundations, place-based funders, large, small, as long as there is a dedicated giving arm to democracy or civic engagement largely defined. And so as we thought about 2024 and coming into this election year, we asked ourselves a lot of questions around how might we best support our members and the work that they're doing day in and day out as we enter this election year. And so we heard a lot of, I want to get involved, but I'm not a political actor, or I don't know how to utilize our current funding strategies towards civic engagement type work. And it kind of got us thinking about two things that we were hearing underneath that were kind of the conflation between democracy and politics, and then coupled with that was the judgment that democracy is a good thing that I should be funding and politics is a bad thing that I shouldn't. And so we decided to kind of spend some time exploring that. And we did that through a series of what we called salons, small, intimate conversations with funders and civic leaders, really kind of getting at some of the questions that came up as we were having these initial conversations with folks. I'm gonna reference my notes because I've got some demographic information and some details that I didn't want to bore you with on a slide. But we had 12 of these conversations and convened about 120 folks throughout these salons. And from the people who gave us their demographic information, I've got some stats for you so you can kind of see the representative sample of the folks that we were talking to. About 60% were women, 80% were middle-aged, as defined 35 to 65 years old. I don't appreciate being called middle-aged. 65% were white. We had Black, Hispanic, and Asian all at around 10% each. And we realized that our conversation skewed heavily liberal, which wasn't something that I was expecting to see in our data. About 68% of our participants identified as liberal, with 75% of them identifying as Democrat. And so actually because of that, I'm hosting another conversation in 2 weeks where we've specifically reached out to conservative folks so that we're able to get their perspective on these conversations also. So at the culmination of these talks, we realized kind of three big picture takeaways. One being that folks were really doing this negative thing with politics, like democracy is good, politics is bad. We also saw that everyone is conflating these terms. And I'm gonna spend a little bit more time on that in just a second. But then lastly, that philanthropy has a long way to go to effectively support democracy in this country. So I'll dig into each of those 3 points. The first being that we started out this conversation, and I'll name that I am a former teacher. I taught kindergarten, I taught 6th grade, I was a middle school principal. And so spending time with me is often like being in a classroom. And I started out these conversations having folks actually write down their definitions of the words democracy and politics. And what was interesting is that so many folks in the room, all practitioners of this work in some way, were like, oh, I've never thought about that. And I'm like, okay, well, that's problematic. And as we continued throughout that activity, we would see that folks, what were kind of a consensus is that when folks were talking about democracy, it was something that they saw as unifying, and it was a system of government. And those were kind of the big picture themes. Whereas with politics, we saw that folks were seeing that connoted as having a divisive, it's a divisive term. Like when you say politics, people think division. and that they're thinking about it as a way that things get done. Then we asked them, well, how would you define partisanship? And folks were like, oh God. Just like, we had 12 of these conversations and it happened every single time. Like people were like, oh, it's actually like partisanship then became the bad guy. And we realized that in most situations, folks were defining democracy as politics, and folks were defining politics as partisanship, and folks were ignoring partisanship. So that is one of our big takeaways, is just like, how are we having conversations utilizing the same words and not at all with the same meaning? The second thing is we had folks then think about how these words are related to one another. And so what I did was I had people actually draw pictures. And if we were virtual, I utilized, there's a virtual whiteboard where you use your mouse to draw. And so we had folks draw out the relationship between democracy, politics, and partisanship. Super interesting. And my favorite example of this connection, someone gave us a sports metaphor, and it is apt as we welcome back the NFL season. But you can think about partisanship as your team. I root for the Buffalo Bills. That's my team. Christian. And politics are the games. When the Bills beat the Rams, right? That's politics. And then democracy is the sport of football. And when we think about football, there are things that you can and cannot do in the sport of football. And as a fan of football, I want those things to be true. I don't want your team to be able to hike the ball before it's time, although if my team does it, I might be okay with it, right? And so how are all of those things coming together in relationship? And then the last thing that was really interesting was this idea that the conflation of these terms is happening. And so we asked folks to plot themselves on a line graph, 1 to 10. How often do you conflate democracy and politics in your day-to-day work? And how often do you find others in philanthropy conflate these concepts? And so what was interesting is that folks were honest. Like I conflate things. I've got some statistics for you here. 48% of folks say that, or people said that they conflate these concepts 48% of the time. But then when we asked about how often they are experiencing this conflation in philanthropy, 68% of the time. So when other people are doing it, it's way more blatant. We see a 20% increase in the amount of conflation that we're able to detect in others. And so a couple of questions come up here. Like one, there's the appreciation for folks being honest about the fact that this conflation is happening. But two, it's like, why are you not seeing yourself as a part of the problem or a part of the opportunity to shift? And so those are kind of our big takeaways as we think about what to do coming out of these conversations. Is this year is such an important one, such a historic conversation as we think about democracy. And democracy is something that's still aspirational. There hasn't been a time where we've all been a part of something, a part of making the decisions about the way that our country is run. That's never happened. And yet we're asking funders to fund aspiration. And how are they doing that? How do we support them in making decisions around things that they haven't done before, such that we're able to have outcomes that we haven't had before? I think that's all. I am happy for questions.
Thank you, Joy. Next we have with us Gauri Ramachandran, the Director of Elections and Security at the Brennan Center for Justice.
Okay, this is working, right? Thank you all for having me here. I really appreciate it. I know some of you may be familiar with the Brennan Center as an organization that is affiliated with NYU. I did not fly all the way out here from New York. I'm the lone Los Angeles employee at the Brennan Center. I finagled myself remote work at the Brennan Center, so I get to be here in usually much better weather while working on these issues at the Brennan Center. And I'll just say in terms of sort of broadly what we do in this space, and maybe like during the questions we can get a little bit more into what we're seeing, this year specifically, and what my team at the Brennan Center is working on specifically this year. I started at the Brennan Center 5 years ago. I used to be a law professor at Southwestern here in Los Angeles. I used to do sort of voter protection volunteering for like partisan volunteering for the Democratic Party, just in my off time as a side sort of hobby or activity. And then I thought, you know what, let me take a 2-year leave. I'm gonna save this election from foreign interference, and this is in 2019, and then I'll just go back to Southwestern and teach my students and teach them what I learned, like doing public advocacy and that sort of thing. It'll be a great new sort of thing for me to teach them how to get involved in. And then the pandemic hit and everything changed, so I ended up leaving Southwestern and I stayed at the Brennan Center. But I started out in my job sort of advocating primarily for better cybersecurity protections for local election offices, and also increased and more consistent funding from federal, state, and local governments so that local election officials can actually implement those best practices and do all of those things. Now, obviously, the job has expanded, and our team that works on these issues at the Brennan Center has expanded, and we work on physical security for election offices and for election workers who are unfortunately being subjected to just this huge increase in threats and intimidation and harassment. We also work on supporting local election officials in really becoming experts in crisis communications and combating disinformation. It's not something that, it was a pretty obscure job before the 2020 election. A lot of people didn't even know what a local, who their local election official was. People certainly didn't know that secretaries of state often administer elections at the state level. And now they're just dealing with this sort of constant flood of false information about the work that they do. So we've also expanded our efforts in that area as well. And yeah, I'll leave the rest for the question period, but that's just a kind of overview of what we're working on.
Thank you. Last but not least, we have Dan Sells, who's the Director of Innovation at the Leadership Now project.
Great, thank you. And I don't see a clock, so Sarah, yell at me if I get too long-winded, or any of you, if you're just bored of me. But no, thank you, Cynthia, so much, and Laura and Nicole for having us here. So yeah, Leadership Now project. We are a membership organization of business leaders committed to protecting in the short term and systematically improving in the long term democracy. And we do that, sort of our theory of change is we believe we can make a difference through our members' capital, influence, and expertise. So capital is probably the most straightforward. A number of our members are high net worth individuals. And so it's almost like a donor advising service where you can get the most ROI for particular philanthropic investment. But what I'd like to talk even more about today are the other two things, because we've just seen how much of an impact the business community's influence and expertise can have. So I know mostly we're going to be talking about sort of democracy, greater than politics or longer term democracy. But just as a quick short term example, because there is a big important election, as you mentioned, coming up. So this week our group came out and announced our endorsement of Vice President Harris. And again, we're not partisan, so we're not endorsing her because she's a Democrat, we're endorsing her because we think she's better for democracy. And lots of people are endorsing Vice President Harris, but the reason that we want to sort of, our swim lane is, if you look at the polls, one of the, actually I think few areas that Trump is really leading in is who's going to handle the economy better. And so we want to be out there saying, no, he's not. Like, there are a lot of reasons one might not like former President Trump, but like if your only goal is to just make a lot of money, you should still vote for Vice President Harris, right? Like Trump's policies on tariffs are going to be really bad for business. His decision to make the Fed not independent is going to be horrific for business. Even taking something like his lack of support for NATO, which is like first and foremost a national security disaster, that will also be very, very bad for business, right? So that's the way that we want to be out there using our business voice to communicate that, because that's such an important sort of messaging lane. But going beyond sort of the 2024 and the big race everybody's thinking about, a lot of our business leaders really care about things like election reform and democracy innovation. So next slide, please. All right, I'm gonna get my like inner weatherman going here. Stop on that cut. But so look at this awesome thing. Look at this great map of all this election reform. I was in a Zoom the other day and somebody said this is the most election reform that's been on the ballot in over 100 years since the progressive era, right? So you see everything like from this high pressure system in Ohio, we're gonna have independent redistricting. In Alaska, over there, we have to defend, they passed what people have been calling the Alaska system, the sort of top four ranked choice voting open primary thing. Arizona, Montana, San Diego, you have open nonpartisan primaries. So you just see like this huge amount in red states and blue states and purple states. So this is, like, take a mental picture of this. This is my like happiness map, right? Like when the like current election and the polls get too scary, this is the thing that makes me feel confident that future elections are not gonna feel quite so existential. So I think that's hugely important, and huge gratitude to Christian. Everyone should say hi to Christian after this. He was just part of a webinar we did with business leaders in Arizona on that nonpartisan primary issue. So really, really exciting stuff there. And just last sort of thing I want to talk about, and then we can get to the Q&A. That's sort of like, I think, actually a pretty short-term reform. I think elections could start feeling a lot better pretty quickly if some of these things pass. But our group also is looking to more structural, longer-term reforms, and that's everything from electoral college reform, so if anybody's interested in that, we have a briefing coming up into the month, to things like deliberative democracy, citizens' assemblies, which is sort of like, jury duty, but for policy. So again, there's a lot of really important stuff we all have to do between now and November, certainly not saying that, but there's also, I think, a tremendous amount of opportunity, and we're really trying to harness the business community to get behind that. So back to you, Sarah, thank you.
Thank you. And I'm a proud member of leadership now, and it has really been incredible to see the needle move over the last 9 months. Joy, I want to start with you. I am going to go a little bit out of order, but I'm not going to go totally off script. You noted in your introduction the increasing politicization of the word democracy. And in addition to the salons that you've been doing, I was curious how you see PACE's work as helping to depoliticize the idea of democracy, and how we, as everyday people, can do that work alongside you, and tips that you might have based on the knowledge that you're getting.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It makes me think of one activity that I didn't describe that I'll share with you around how we were supporting folks and thinking about the way that their giving would be sorted. So I had them do a sorting activity where they wrote down orgs that they were donating funds to, and then I had them sort, is that in service of democracy? Is that in service of politics? Or is that in service of, it depends, like unclear? And so even the active thought process of what is my outcome in taking this action? Is it because I want my team to win? Is it because I want us all to win? And like, how do we think about democracy as bigger than winning, but about the sandbox that we're all in to be able to have our voices heard in this country? So I think that the question to yourself around to what end is something to be supportive around the depolitization of the term democracy. And then my counterpart at PACE actually has been doing some really interesting work around language. She has polled thousands of Americans all across the country and has been doing this work. It's called the Civic Language Perceptions Project, whereby we are polling people's different perceptions of particular civic terms. So me as a Black woman in Los Angeles hears the word patriot very differently than perhaps a middle-aged white man in the Midwest. And like, what does that mean for the way that we're thinking about the language that we're using in marketing, in branding, in campaigns to ensure that the folks that you are hoping will hear your message hears you?
Thank you. I'm going to jump to Gowrie, just so that, if cybersecurity is more your issue and something that you're more interested in, we kind of, we'll have a little back and forth. I wanted to take a step back and make sure that everyone has a firm grasp on what election disinformation actually means. Is disinformation and misinformation the same thing to you? And can you walk us through what the Brennan Center is doing towards election integrity, especially for this upcoming election?
Sure. So the term disinformation, it actually comes from like national security agencies and that sort of thing. And those folks tend to use the term to distinguish from two other kinds of sort of bad or harmful information, I would say, which are misinformation and malinformation. And we actually work on all three at the Brennan Center. So the way people traditionally define misinformation is it's just false information, but it might not be intentionally false. So it might not be accurate to say, that person is lying, right? Because they might not realize that what they're saying isn't true. Disinformation is, to me, like a fancy word for lying. So it's basically intentionally spreading false information for some purpose, right? It might be to interfere in another country's political process, right? That sort of thing. And then malinformation is a term that those folks use really to encompass things that they might be true, but they're really, really harmful and dangerous. So it could be like doxing somebody, like putting their home address up on the internet and then that causing all kinds of dangers to them. Saying, revenge porn would be an example outside the elections context. Taking private messages that someone has sent you and then like posting those publicly in order to cause harm to them. And we actually work in different ways to combat all three of those in the elections context at the Brennan Center. So we've long at the Brennan Center, even before I started there, advocated for regulating false information about the time, place, and manner of elections. So things like, oh, Democrats, go vote on Wednesday, right? Things like that. We've long advocated for regulating that. Sure, we have a First Amendment in the United States. We believe in free speech, but that's the type of speech that to us, we're like, that's like yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? Like you should not be allowed to spread false information that misleads people about exercising their fundamental rights. So we definitely work to, one of the things we do is we put out, like fact sheets and explainers and things like that, things that the media can trust and rely on. But we also really try to support local and state election officials in communicating accurate and truthful information and correcting the record. We advocate with social media companies to it's essentially free advertising to local election officials. Like sometimes if you log into your social media and you see at the top of the feed something reminding you of the deadline to register to vote, that's because of sort of voluntary social responsibility actions that the social media companies have taken to work with election officials, get the correct information, and sort of make that most prominent. We also work on the malinformation issue, unfortunately, because as I mentioned before, now that our work has expanded to cover threats and harassment and intimidation of election workers, and really elected officials more broadly, there's been a real uptick in intimidation of and harassment of elected officials. So we work to there's a number of things we've done, but just to sort of combat this rise in threats, we've advocated for security budgets that are like physical security budgets for local officials. We've also formed, we kind of support this organization called the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, and it's a partnership of law enforcement and election officials sort of working together to sort of really put the message out there that sort of threats and harassment against poll workers, election staff, that kind of thing has no place in America and in American democracy. And really promoting sort of coordination between those groups before the election to avoid actually sort of over-policing and that sort of thing. If you have a plan in place ahead of time, if law enforcement knows, like, this is the person who, if there is an emergency, is going to call me, and who I should believe that there's something for us to race over there and do, versus, responding to every sort of swatting incident or that sort of thing that might happen, you can actually avoid sort of overuse of law enforcement that can intimidate voters. So those are kind of the areas that we sort of broadly are working in. And yeah, it's really about supporting us putting out the truthful information, supporting those trusted sources of truthful information, and also trying to increase protections for people that are being really directly harmed, I think, by some of the abusive activity that's going on online.
And going back to social media, do you feel like we are in a better position for this election than we were in 2016 and 2020 with respect to either the threat that social media poses for misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, or do you feel like there's still a lot of work to be done?
I unfortunately feel like in some ways we've really backslid. So a lot of the really big social media platforms have just like gutted their trust and safety teams. They've reduced their staff and reduced their investment in these issues. And of course, there's one social media platform where the owner is himself spreading election disinformation online and hate speech and those sorts of things. So that I think is a really unfortunate thing that's happened. But there's also been this real attack on researchers and academics who've been working on this problem that's been really harmful. So we work with researchers who try to study the spread of disinformation online, and we actually, each month we basically take, what's like the most sort of prominent or fastest spreading rumor about elections, and then we do message testing to see what kinds of corrective information, truthful information is most moves the needle in terms of voters understanding that was false and believing the truth. And then we shared the results of that message testing with, actually we convene a roundtable of election officials from most of the major metropolitan areas in the United States. It covers like about, I think last we checked, about 35 million voters. But what we rely on for all of this work is those researchers and tracking disinformation. And unfortunately, there's just been a huge attack on the folks who do this work. There's been sort of weaponized congressional committee hearings where professors at Stanford who have been leading a lot of this work, and even their students at times, their student research assistants have been like hauled in for closed-door interviews in front of this congressional committee with the claim that everything they were doing is censoring conservative voices, when in fact they were really just sharing, doing the research and then sharing the results of the research with election officials, with the government, with social media companies. And ironically, when you talk to some of these researchers, they say the idea that we were like able to tell the social media companies what to do and like what kinds of content to allow online, they're like, it's just laughable. They're like, most of the time when we would contact them, they would ignore us, right? And the thing would stay up and it would be infuriating. But they've been really attacked by this congressional committee. And the federal government was sued, and in separate lawsuits, a lot of these researchers at Stanford and University of Washington were sued by folks claiming that they were part of, like, I'm not making this up, they were part of a censorship industrial complex that was like working to censor people spreading COVID disinformation and election disinformation. And as a result of all of this, eventually those lawsuits are all going to be dismissed. The lawsuit against the federal government was eventually appealed up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, the federal government did not coerce social media companies into doing all these things, in part because, most of the time the social media companies just do what they want to do, like they didn't listen, right? But the effect of all of that has been really, really harmful. The institute at Stanford that was studying election disinformation has been shut down. People's donations to these institutes have dried up. So I think, the attacks on these researchers, the lawsuit, even though ultimately it failed against the federal government, and just these companies sort of really dialing back their efforts and their investment on moderating content. I think, unfortunately, all of that puts us in a worse position. But so that is one of the things we advocate for at the Brennan Center, is that, now that the Supreme Court has made clear government and social media companies are allowed to talk to each other, they're allowed to share truthful information, it's time to really double down on those efforts and make sure that Americans have accurate information about elections.
I love that the Brennan Center, their quote is that informed citizens are democracy's best defense. And so just on that note, in today's information ecosystem, it feels difficult, I think, for all of us to really pinpoint which sources have integrity and which sources we can go to be informed, in the face of so much misinformation. So for those of us who are truly committed to being the most informed citizens we can be, what sources has the Brennan Center specifically identified that we can go to, whether it is, social media accounts or media outlets that you feel have still maintained a standard of integrity that is up to your standards?
Well, I think when it comes to the mechanics of elections, like, when is the election, what are the rules, what's the process for counting, I think state and local election officials really are the experts. So finding out who your local election official is, or even who is the local election official in this jurisdiction I'm really interested in, if it's somewhere outside California, and familiarizing yourself with their website, because I always say people get very concerned about like deep fakes and that sort of thing now, and they're like, how do I even know if what I'm looking at is real? If you know it's being hosted on the website of a trusted official, then that's how you can at least, that's how you can trust that information. So I think that would be, the primary source for that. But I also think it's really important for people to not allow the very real threats of AI and disinformation to make them just trust nobody, right? So I think mainstream media sources that are reporting on results and those sorts of things are still they're very accurate. They really care about doing a good job. I can tell you that the major media outlets, they ask organizations like the Brennan Center and other nonpartisan trusted organizations to help them make sure that they are looking to the right sources before an election. So I think it's important to yes, verify your sources. If you see something online that just seems outrageous and gives you a really emotional reaction, that is a sign that you might want to double check it and verify the source. But at the same time, I think going to those mainstream media outlets for things like results, and going to local election officials for information on the mechanics of the election, I think it's important that people know that they can still trust those sources. Yeah, it's not like every picture you see in the Associated Press is some kind of AI generated photo, right?
It's encouraging. Dan, for those of us who would want to take your advice in terms of the success metrics that the everyday person can apply from business leaders and thought leaders in furthering pro-democracy efforts, if we wanted to approach it as if we were all high net worth individuals that had the ability to impact democracy, what are those traits, what are those efforts that you see that are working the most?
Yeah, great question. I'll give you a metric and an approach, cheating on the question a little bit, but metric for those of you from startup or entrepreneurship land, maybe Laura looking at you, CAC, or customer acquisition cost, right? So if you're an entrepreneur and you're like, okay, I want to start a new app to get people to share cat photos or whatever, the first thing you're going to be thinking about is how much money do I have to spend to get each of my cat photo sharing people, right? And you're going to be really rigorous on that. How much do my AdWords cost? How many times do people need to view an ad before they convert to sharing cat photos, all that. And I think a lot of times, sometimes at least in sort of democracy entrepreneurship land, people aren't thinking about that as intuitively, right? They're just like, oh, ranked choice voting is really important. The end. And even if you're a nonprofit, even if you're trying to save the world, you still have to think about who are my customers, how do I get them in the door, how do I build a budget around that. So just a plug for one of my favorite startups in this space, Common Sense American, if anybody has heard of them, Keith Allred. I see one person nodding. They're doing really cool work bringing blues and reds and independents together to talk about and find common ground on policy things, right? And so he, in one of my first calls with him, he's out there bragging about his CAC. I'm not sure I'm supposed to say this on a recorded thing, but it is super low. It's super low because his point is people are hungry for this kind of productive conversation in democracy. So if the cat photo app guy has to spend $100 because I have to show somebody 1,000 ads before they convert, his is actually much lower because people are so hungry for this and it's so interesting. So I think that's a really important kind of mindset. And on the mindset thing, the sort of broader strategy I was going to talk about is this idea of again, from entrepreneurship land, because I got an MBA and focused on tech commercialization, but this idea of like go-to-market strategy, or like choosing your market, right? So again, if you really care about ranked choice voting, you saw the map I just showed of like a lot of people are looking at it like a state level. So your market, or your first market might be a state like Arizona, let's say. But I was just talking to, I think, Sarah Theo, just heard about this very cool nonprofit called the Cornerstone Foundation, and they're like, our market, we care about ranked choice voting, and our market is actually gonna be school boards, because people feel like they can influence school boards, right? Like it's very hard to think about, oh, Dan, am gonna go change how the federal government votes, or even how the state of California votes, but Culver City, where I live, is 40,000 people. I just joined the PTA, I feel very proud about myself. I feel like I can probably make change there, right? I probably know half the people that are gonna vote in that school board race. So if I care about ranked choice voting, that's sort of a great way to get people familiar with, get high school students familiar with it. So it's like a very cool theory of change. And it's a very cool kind of first market to approach if what you ultimately care about is spreading ranked choice voting across the country. So I think kind of pulling in these sort of like business disciplines or metrics or way of thinking is super helpful as we think about trying to improve democracy.
CAC.
CAC.
And that stands for?
Customer Acquisition Cost.
Okay.
There you go, new term. There'll be pamphlets in the front.
Joy, I'm coming back to you. I'm just so curious to know if your organization has seen an uptick in funding and giving since President Biden decided to withdraw from the race and Kamala Harris became the nominee. I feel like we've all kind of felt this energetic shift from what was very much a political Groundhog Day. And so, I'm just curious if that tracks in terms of your clients and the organizations that you work with and feeling like they have more of an energy towards giving and how that's been impacted.
There's definitely been an energetic shift. Like the increase of excitement around this election is definitely something that's also happening in the field of philanthropy. I can't say that there's been an increase in giving because I don't have the data on it. And there's been an increase in folks that may or may not have already had a portfolio of giving around democracy, interested in ways that they can be involved in work that is democratic and not political. So there's been an uptick in the number of interest conversations I've had with foundations. There's been an uptick of opportunities of us connecting some of our members to foundations that are seeking ways to dip their toe in the water, although I don't have data on actual giving numbers.
One of the things that really stuck out to me when I was reading about PACE and the work that you do is these two words that feel very much like objectives for you, which are innovation and experimentation. And you describe your approach as like a philanthropic laboratory, which I love because I feel like it just brings it down, it telescopes it down to words that we can understand, even if we're not super familiar with the field of philanthropy. Do you find that funders find you and they come to you with this type of mindset of innovation and experimentation and really wanting to take that approach in their philanthropy, or is that something that you're trying to instill from the get-go?
Oh, I absolutely think that it's both. And I've got a couple of member orgs in the room, so something that I know that has also been really supportive are the recommendations from folks that have been in our orbit. And so something that's really true about philanthropy is I don't want to be the first one to give on this initiative. It's like, do we know that giving to this organization or in this area is going to have impact? And I'm afraid to be the first one to do it for fear that it doesn't. And something that's really beneficial about PACE is having a network of like-minded folks who are interested in the same things that you're interested in, to be able to have conversation with, bounce ideas off of, ask questions to, brainstorm around, and potentially take collective action. So I think that folks are curious and want the support, and they hear that PACE can offer that, and so then they become curious about the membership.
I feel like this is like a democracy lab. I like that description. I mean, it really it's very visual. Gary, I'm going to go back to you because I want to talk about AI. It's something that we hear about every day in the media, and I feel like different industries have very different perspectives on AI. If you're in the medical and science field, it's there's mostly just upshot. If you're in Hollywood, AI is the villain. So, what are specific artificial intelligence threats to the election that we should be aware of, that we might be able to notice ourselves, just as lay people? And are there applications of AI that the Brennan Center is also seeing are being used to actually fortify election security?
Sure. So I think most people have probably heard about deepfakes, right, or seen an example of them, and I think that's one where we don't feel like we need to raise awareness on it. It was like, okay, we were really worried when we saw some of the early, advanced examples of it, and turns out lots of members of Congress and state assemblies are also really worried about it because they're worried about deepfakes being made of themselves. But I think something that we are concerned about and really trying to raise awareness of more is the potential for deepfakes being made of just less prominent people, right? If someone makes a deepfake about Elizabeth Warren, that can get cleared up really fast, right? But what about like the Arizona Secretary of State, right? Does anyone even know what he really looks like or sounds like? I mean, I do, but I think most people who aren't really in the weeds on this don't know, right? And so, we are concerned about something like a deepfake audio of, let's say, a state election official like that being used to manipulate a local official or a local employee into sort of giving up a password or that sort of thing. Also potentially being used to manipulate the public, like if you have someone saying, this person won, or we're seeing a huge amount of election fraud this year, or something like that in a deepfake. We're worried about those kind of less prominent, less celebrity people having their likeness used in this way. So I think raising awareness about that, and again going back to actually the website of the election official, right? Is this announcement actually being linked to from there, or is this something you're getting from a kind of reputable source? So that's one thing we're worried about. We're also really, I'm really worried about actually this sort of increase in just the scale of the same kinds of disinformation we've seen in previous years, because it's just cheaper to do it now. You can do it at less cost because of the advent of AI, and some of the sort of techniques people used to use to sort of realize oh, that's that the email is probably a phishing email because it has half the words are spelled wrong in it and that kind of thing. Those techniques are harder to use now because the AI has allowed people to sort of really cheaply crank out some of this stuff and have it look a little bit more polished and sophisticated. So I'm just worried about the sort of increase in the amount of the same kinds of things we've seen in the past. And particularly sort of increase in the amount of disinformation about immigrants and people of color. So we're seeing a lot of leaders currently spreading this myth that there's widespread amounts of non-citizens voting in American elections, which is just totally false. It is vanishingly rare. I mean, think about it. If you're an immigrant to the United States, why would you commit a felony and put your whole future at risk to probably not have an impact on the outcome of an election, right? It's very few elections are decided by one vote, so why would anyone do that? But there are, even leaders, unfortunately, currently, really pushing this myth. And at the same time, there are people who are spreading a lot of myths about immigrants and crime. So recently there was a false story being propagated about an apartment complex in Aurora, Colorado that had supposedly been taken over by a gang of immigrants, and this was just completely false. The real story was that the residents of the complex were complaining that their landlord was not keeping up their facilities, right? They were complaining that it had become uninhabitable because of things falling into disrepair. And it was in a sort of high crime neighborhood or that sort of thing, but no, there's nothing a gang of people having taken it over. So I think we're just seeing a lot of really anti-immigrant rhetoric outside the context of elections, at the same time as you have this myth about widespread fraud and non-citizen voting being propagated. And I just worry that the scale of that and the cost of that is so much cheaper that could be used to really spur a lot of distrust in the outcome of an election that officials have done tons of work to really do everything they can to make sure it is going to be a safe and secure election for Americans.
Is there a silver lining? Is there a way that...
Make us feel better.
Yeah. On that note, is there a way that AI is being used by, whether it's nonprofits or the government potentially, to shore up elections, either on a state-by-state basis or federally?
So there are a lot of election officials who are kind of just like interested in the long term. We do a survey of local election officials every year, and the percentage that are actually using AI in some way currently, at least that they know they're using it, is very, very low. But there was a pretty high interest in the future using it, getting recommendations from government about how to use it safely. And some of the examples I've seen are really interesting. Actually, here in LA County, the Registrar Dean Logan had mentioned that we have to make ballots available in a huge number of languages in LA County, and for voters with disabilities, that touchscreen machine that you go on if you vote in person needs to have the capability to hook up an audio device to it so that you can have the ballot read out to you, and that needs to be in all those 50 some languages that are made available in Los Angeles County. And we have that vote center model here where you can go vote anywhere in the county. So you got to have all the languages available at every vote center, right? And Dean Logan has said, it could be great to use AI potentially to make sure that everyone's kind of getting the same tone of voice, the same pauses, between the different questions on the ballot. There's no kind of lack of equity, where in one language it's being read too fast, to hear it in another language. It's not. That could be potentially really great use of it, especially because elections are really underfunded in the United States. So anything where you can replace labor, frankly, is helpful in elections because it is such a sort of poorly paid sector of government in this country. On the other hand, for sure, anytime you're creating election materials, voter-facing things, the risk of getting it wrong is massive, right? And so you obviously don't want to have a mistranslation when it comes to having educational materials for voters or the ballot itself, God forbid. Another area where some election officials are interested in using AI is in signature matching. So a lot of jurisdictions that have absentee ballots, they'll match the signature you put on the envelope to the signature on file to make sure that was really you who returned the ballot. AI might be faster at doing that signature matching, or even better potentially over time. But again, there's been many instances of people finding sort of bias that was never intended by the software developers in AI, just based on the data it was trained on, sort of combining with a model in unexpected ways. And so that's another, high potential, but also really high risk area where making sure to build in safeguards and against bias in particular is really important before it's ready for prime time. Yeah.
Yeah, the efficiency and the cost cutting, that makes total sense, and it's definitely something that we should think about. I want to go back to the thread that we've been talking about throughout the panel about the need to separate politics from democracy, or civics from democracy, civics from politics. Dan, this question is for you. Leadership now encourages reframing political issues as business issues. Can you give us one or two concrete examples where looking at a pressing issue from a business perspective rather than a political perspective may have resulted in a depoliticization of that issue?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a great question, very much what we're trying to do, going back to the example of how we can use business to talk about democracy. So a couple concrete examples. You see, my map's gone. You see Ohio is there, and people in Ohio are going to get to vote to end gerrymandering there, which is super exciting. Some of you might have remembered this made national news last year. Ohio had a ballot measure in August to basically end ballot measures. Effectively, the very gerrymandered state legislature was trying to take power back from the people because they knew that there would be an abortion rights ballot that would win with over 50% of the people in November. So they convened a special election in like August or July or something like that, knowing, and like the officials are on record saying, we did this because we know people don't vote. You know, like the only way that this can happen is if people don't turn out. So that was an issue our group took up. We had a bunch of business leaders speak out on this, again, framing it as a business issue. My favorite, because I love ice cream, is Jenny from Jenny's Splendid Ice Creams was one of our business leaders. And she's like, look, I'm from Columbus, I'm running a business in Columbus. This is a business issue, right? This is a talent issue. I'm trying to get the best and brightest from all over the country to come move to Columbus, and they are not gonna move here if they feel like there's this weird ploy to take away their voting rights, right? This is a business issue. This is a growing the economy issue. And so I think that led to like, I'm not saying we get full credit, but I think it really did help cut through the noise that was going, because there was so much noise there. There was so much malinformation about that particular initiative, and I think hearing business leaders say this is just about jobs, this is about the economy, really helped. And then the second example I can give, even more recent, I mentioned the webinar that Christian was good enough to help us with. We just did a webinar. We are organizing business leaders in Arizona around that nonpartisan primary initiative in Arizona. And again, that for those who aren't familiar with nonpartisan primaries, basically right now in Arizona, there's a Democratic primary and a Republican primary. And part of why we see so much dysfunction in politics is because people don't vote very frequently in primaries, and the ones who do tend to be the most extreme. And there are lots of examples of politicians saying, I'm in a gerrymandered seat, so I'm basically only performing for 5% of my constituents. Those 5% are gonna show up in a very partisan D or R primary. So again, we now have an opportunity in Arizona, Arizonans have an opportunity in Arizona to take that back and make nonpartisan primaries. Basically, it's just 2 rounds of voting. It's actually what we have, similar, right, Christian, to what we have in California, although maybe don't share that recording with Arizona. But anyway, so as you can imagine, there's a lot of mis and disinfo cropping up around that ballot initiative. And again, this is an opportunity we see business leaders to write op-eds and put voter guides statements out there saying, again, this is a business issue, right? We need pragmatic politics, we need real policy, we don't need the latest culture war fight, we need you to fix our infrastructure, we need you to take care of water in Arizona, right? And we're not seeing that with our current political climate because of these misaligned incentives. So again, as a business leader, I need better policy, and so therefore I need nonpartisan primaries. And again, we see that resonating with voters in a way that sort of more typical partisan messaging doesn't. So again, can we reframe something as a business issue?
And so on that note, you've seen statistically that more Americans trust businesses than they trust government. What is it about a capitalistic society, a society that is very much focused on, like you said, the economic over the political, that supports a thriving democracy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think America is in many ways a capitalistic country. We are the country that brought the prosperity gospel to the world, so people have this deep-seated belief in this. And, that's not to say business is perfect, but I think when most Americans think about the kind of business they want to see run, right? One based on things like accountability, fairness, respect. I'm gonna totally steal that sports metaphor, I love that. Like, people want business to respect the rules of the game, right? They want football to be played fairly. They want business to be played fairly. They want business to have an opportunity to grow jobs. I think that resonates with a lot of people. So I think, again, that opportunity to say we all kind of know how we want business to run. We want it to be accountable. We want it to be transparent. We want it to be fair. It makes sense for people to say, well, that's how the government should run. And I think that cuts across parties, right? I think in our coalition at Leadership Now, we have plenty of people that, came of age as Republicans in the 80s saying, like, why can't government run more like business? Why can't it be more efficient? And so I think this message of good, efficient government really resonates with a lot of people. And then, of course, the other piece of it is business needs democracy, right? Like, that's the other thing that we find to be true. Like, I think it's 97 of the 100 biggest companies in the world are in democracies, right? And there's a reason for this. Again, fairness, accountability, respect for rule of law. So as people think about wanting to have thriving economies and become more prosperous, I think that helps them understand how they need a fair set of football rules to play by.
I'd love to open it up for questions. I think we have time, right?
Plenty of time. I think you told you that.
I think we're going to walk one on this
through.
Okay, great. Yeah, we do want to know, yeah, maybe we'll give that one to tomorrow. I'll keep this one.
I was just going to say, you know, I would love, well, did you have something you want to say, Sarah, or should I just go ahead?
I can, yeah.
I was just going to say that there's so many people in here that I know personally are representing so many different groups that I would love to have you have a chance to ask a question and briefly introduce the group that you represent that may align with, you know, what sector we're talking about, because that's, this, first of all, this was just amazing. Like, thank you so much. It was so informative in so many ways. It was exactly what I hoped and what I think Laura and Nicole and I were talking about. And Dan, I must thank you for really pulling it all together. Everyone came through you, and I really appreciate it. It's just been the idea of bringing all these sectors together. You've each given amazing examples of what you can do and what you are doing, and I want to hear more about it. I just, as a, you know, reason why we did this and how successful I think it's been so far. The other part of it was who is in the room. And so the people that are in this room that represent different things, we would like to hear from you too. Not a lot, but you know, a little bit, like, so that we can carry on the conversation.
And then we want to hear more at the reception, obviously.
Yes,
That's
and then
when
you
we
have
really
a chance
want
to network and everything.
get to know each other.
So who has a question? Mary Jane?
Thank you so much for the really interesting presentations that you've made. I'm going to talk about my connection with local public media, particularly looking at the need for an informed citizenry. I'm on the board of Southern California Public Radio, which has LAist here. And those of you who live here probably know that LAist puts out a voter guide every year. But the problem is that local public media is declining in this country, like all news organizations. And I think it's an area that's vitally important to sustain and to make sure is there to help educate and the citizenry and make sure people do have unbiased information. So just putting in a thought about local public media.
Who else? Christian, do you want to
Hi, I'm Allison Lee. I'm with the organization called PEN America, which kind of sits at the intersection of literature and free expression. Thank you so much. We focus on fighting disinformation with journalists, and so I will echo that importance of local media, because most often it's that local media that is the most trusted source and the easiest gateway for misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. And so we're doing a lot of work, and especially single language local media sources are, you know, a real way for disinformation to spread. But my question for you, because one of the things that, you know, as a free expression organization, and when you come to civic engagement and you think of civil discourse as the cornerstone of our democracy, and as a free expression organization is something that we think about a lot, because, you know, that when you're protecting free expression, it's not the expression you agree with, it's really the expression you disagree with. And so, and that is the cornerstone of our democracy. So from your perspective, both, you know, at Leadership Now and at PACE, like this idea of bringing together, whether it's business leaders or philanthropists, across the spectrum, when we're so siloed and there's so little that brings us together across difference, how, you know, in what ways are you finding that, you know, the through line is the uplift of our democracy, and in what ways are you finding that that work is something that is bringing people together? Because the team is, you know, what we're fighting for is, you know, the overarching team, not our own team, but yeah, the football, the sport. Sorry, the sport. Yeah.
I'll start, Dan. because something that feels like a hot topic right now in philanthropy, and it's interesting as I censor myself around, like I'm like, ooh, what language do I use to describe this type of work? It's like, is it bridging work? Is it depolarization? Is it social cohesion? And depending on who I'm speaking to, I will decide which of those phrases to utilize. But that is an entire segment of a philanthropic strategy right now in the democracy and civic engagement space, is what are the things that on the left, on the right, we actually just agree on this outcome, and how do we have conversations across those lines of difference such that we can come up with innovative laboratory ways to be able to give such that that outcome is being met. And it's really interesting when folks are able to have conversations across lines of difference and realize that often outcomes are similar, if not aligned, and that the challenging part is actually getting folks to the table. Once we are seated and we are eating the bread, we are playing the sport, like the outcome comes more readily.
I think just building on that, yes, everything Joy said, I think the term I hear most is bridging. There's like a whole field of practice of just bringing Blue and Red America back together. I happen to volunteer with a group called Braver Angels that's doing this. Bridge USA is doing it on college campuses. I think it's super important. There was a woman who was supposed to be here who's in LA, Kara, I don't know how to say her last name, Jasinski, I think, who's leading a group called Resolutionaries that's trying to pass this thing called the Building Civic Bridges Act, which is basically like right now the federal government, I think going back to Reagan, spends $320 million a year on like healthy democracy stuff abroad and $0 in the country, right? So we're trying to just get, I think the House bill is 15 million, Senate's 20 or vice versa, but just get our federal government to start funding this kind of stuff, right? Funding the underlying civic health, bringing Blue and Red America back together. So I think all those efforts are super important. We have business leaders that are trying to help there. I think the last thing I'd say quickly on it, I think, going back to this laboratory idea, I think there's a very adjacent topic that I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is this idea of loneliness. And for those who don't know, the Surgeon General, I think last year just came out with a big report that's framing loneliness as an epidemic. I see you not yet. And so basically the same worry that like basically is why we're not all like chain smoking in this room, because they're like, this kills millions of people every year, is saying that loneliness is killing more people than cigarettes did in the 50s right now, right? And so that's, I think, very adjacent to this challenge, because part of why people become so susceptible, I think, to dis and misinfo is because they're cut off from like in-person interactions where you'd be like, hey, I saw this thing online. All your friends around a bar would be like, no, that's bananas. When you just live by yourself and you don't have a connection to people, those are the kind of things that happen. So I think we're really trying, I don't have a great answer, but I know like Braver Angels, for example, is doing a screening with like Robert Putnam, the Bowling Alone guy, about like, he has a new thing, Join or Die. So I think how do we think about rebuilding kind of this civic connectivity, this sort of community engagement sort of stuff is very much germane to the increasingly large laboratory of democracy.
And that's making me think of just really quickly, how do you see yourself as a part of something larger? I feel like is a big democracy, civic engagement question also. It's like, do I see, what are the groups that I see myself as a part of? How do I feel like I have a voice and a space in those groups? And how do I see myself as a part of democracy broadly? Feels like a question that is like currently going unanswered. It's like, how do we get folks to see themselves as more than just left or right, red or blue, but like as a citizen here that's a part of a functioning democracy?
That is, Sarah, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you're doing, because I think that's
Sure. Yeah, so I have a Substack called Civic EQ, Emotionally Intelligent Civics, that is geared towards helping parents be more confident in their own civic literacy so that it just is a more organic experience for us to raise civic-minded kids. And for me, it started with just, you know, a realization that parents are very adrift, especially this generation, in terms of, you know, schools aren't really teaching it. Schools haven't been teaching civics for a long time. And it, you know, comes down to funding, comes down to all of it. But I think that since COVID, there's been such a collapse of the, you know, it's like teacher, student, parent, and everyone's kind of doing, parents, I think, were doing a lot of the things that they expected schools to be doing. And so there's just really not an expectation anymore that schools will take care of civic education. And I think that because our generation, we've acknowledged the problem, For me, I mean, it just makes the most sense to empower parents so that, you know, it's something that we feel more confident in, and then we won't kick it to the schools or, you know, whoever other third party to do it. And so we are bringing together as many voices as we can. I call them civic influencers, trying to bring resources to parents to let them know not only content that will be helpful for their kids that they may not know is available out there, that's actually entertaining, that's fun, because like Civics needs a major facelift, as we all know. But also information that we can bring to parents in a way that parents, and especially my generation of parents, would, you know, we're in this information age. We're used to being able to go and Dr. Becky tells us, you know, what we need to do if our kid is hitting other kids, and, you know, we take that 2-minute soundbite and problem solved. And so, you know, we're trying to apply that to civics. Make it fun, make it accessible, make it something that parents actually live, you know, day to day, so that it's something that kids see. And I don't know, I mean, anytime I feel hopeless, you know, which like we all do here and there, I think you just think about, you know, like the kids, there is so much, even Gen Z, they're out there, you know, they're out there, they're doing stuff, they care, they're engaged. And so I think if we can take our generation, which has not historically been super engaged, but now we're parents, and so we can't really just throw up our hands, and we say, you know, like, we're gonna now pick up the post and we're gonna make sure that this Gen Alpha, which is what my 2-year-old is part of, is, you know, they're going to be the next generation. And so that's the platform. It's a community of parents. So if you are a parent, I hope you join us.
And mention what you're doing with them.
Yeah, talk about Jason Alexander. Say that cool thing.
Okay. I live in Larchmont Village, and it's very community-based. We moved 2 years ago from New York, and being in a walkable community has been great for us. And so I've been trying very hard to get, you know, start the parent dialogue in my local community of Larchmont, and then we'll scale to other parts of LA. But we started a story time with Civic EQ, which is at Chevalier's Books in Larchmont, which is it's a Saturday morning story time that has a civic themed book that parents can bring to their kids. And so we actually kicked it off yesterday. We had a really great turnout. We read One Vote, Two Vote, I Vote, You Vote. And it was all about voting. Mark Feuerstein did that for us, which was amazing. And then in 3 weeks, we'll do our second one with Jason Alexander, who's gonna read 2 incredible books. One is about organizing in unions, and the other one is about presidential elections. So, you know, I mean, again, it's like parents want to have all looking for things to go to on Saturday morning with our kid, like really. And if it's something that can be fun for us, and also just consistent modeling for the kids, like we're taking them because we think this is important. If it sticks at some point, amazing. Yeah.
A stanza for civics. I love that so much.
Stanza for
I love
civics.
that so much.
Sarah, do you want to mention something about democracy?
So, hi, Sarah. Oh, and there's a microphone. Oh, lovely. Hi, Sarah with Democracy. I was so struck by the point that democracy has always been aspirational, right? And I was thinking about the fact that 29% of Congress is women, although they're 51% of the population, and it's 9% women of color, although they're 20% of the population. And thinking that high school is the last time boys and girls run for office equally. So one of the things that Democracy is trying to do is start in high school with the pipeline moving forward the next generation of voters and future elected officials, so that they will have the social work skills to overcome the barriers that we know women and women of color face that are very specific, so that when 40% of your Twitter feed is hate speech, and your nervous system dysregulates, as ours does when we read the news, there are skills to deal with that and not just get flooded and overwhelmed. And I guess my question for you is what you feel about, because the other thing we do is pay our students so that people can access these early political pipeline opportunities that tend to be unpaid internships. And in your football analogy, what is the work being done we need to understand that you need to be in the stadium, you need to be on the field, you need to be doing the rules of the game, for the people who are working and don't even have time to look up the football schedule, right? They can't even engage football as a game because they're overwhelmed, right? 77% of our students are first generation Americans. So in that analogy, how are we reaching out to those who don't even turn on the TV?
I love this question, and I don't have an answer. And I don't make a habit of making things up in front of large groups of people. And so, one, I really appreciate this provocation, and I love how this football analogy has just run away today. And it's making me think about the importance of the impact of the organizations that are part of our membership. Like something that I say when I'm describing my work to like family members, I'm like, we support the people who give the money to the people who are doing the things. And I think that like your conversation is getting at how do we uplift the opportunity to be giving the money to the people that are doing the things that will enable folks to be more proximate to the stadium. And I, again, don't have an answer, but I'm like, there's something about where's the intersection of local journalism and like information about opportunities to be able to fund specific initiatives for particular populations that need it most. And I think that that's a large opportunity that exists and something for us to continue considering. And we should talk about, my daughter goes to an all-girls high school, so you and I need to talk after.
Hi everybody. My name is David Levitas, the founder and executive director of LA Forward Institute, here with Lorraine Lundquist, our board chair. Really appreciate the panel, it's phenomenal, and yeah, so enlightening and inspiring. You know, one of the things that LA Forward Institute does is we're trying to fulfill the promise of democracy here in LA County. It's 10 million people, it'd be like the 8th largest state if it were a state, and work to make this a more fair and flourishing place for everybody. And I think one of the interesting, you know, so many of the challenges that you all mention around democracy and civic engagement, like we have here in Los Angeles with challenges with the government not working, many social problems, except it's in such a different context of, it's not the red-blue polarization, it's just a whole different ball game, to use the metaphor. We're playing rugby, not football or whatever it may be. And so I wonder, you know, if any of you have thoughts on that, and I'm also curious, particularly around funding, like, it feels to me, as someone who's, you know, been doing this for a while, like, the funding landscape for the kind of the local democracy work in like deep blue places looks very different than, say, the funding landscape for like in polarized swing states or mostly red states. And I'm just curious if you all have any reflections upon that. And if not, that's okay too. It was really lovely being here with all of you.
I'll buy you some time if you stop. No, it's a great question, when we think about a lot. So at Leadership Now, I didn't say this, but we have both sort of a national modality, so there are a bunch of things we work on as a whole group of business leaders, and then kind of a state or chapter-based modality. So we have a group in Arizona, that's how that came together. We have a group in Wisconsin that was very involved in like the Supreme Court judges race and all that. And we have a group in LA and San Francisco, and I feel like one of the things that comes up all the time is, and I would imagine some folks here can sympathize with this, if you care about democracy in LA, sometimes you feel like my role is just to be the nation's piggy bank, right? I'm sending money to these swing statey places, right? Because everybody is the red-blue thing. And yet, as you pointed out, democracy, it's a different challenge than what people are seeing in Arizona, but it's not perfect. And so I think that's something that a lot of our members are thinking about. And I think it's, the way I think about it, if this is helpful at all, is California is a really great place to experiment for a lot of reasons. Things don't feel as existential sometimes here as they do in some swing state kind of places. And like for the same reason that like it's so important that California is leading on things like auto emissions to like set a standard for the rest of the country, if you can get some of these cool democracy things going here, I think that's a great map for the rest of the country. So we have a LA member, for example, that's very involved with a group called ProRep that's trying to start proportional representation as a thing, starting in California for that reason. There's a group, there's a gentleman I invited, Mike, who's I'm like the king of inviting people who didn't come apparently, but If anyone wants to know more about this, Mike Draskevich has started this thing called Public Democracy LA that's trying to bring a citizen assembly to LA and sort of pilot that here. So I hugely appreciate your thinking that it's not the first thing that comes to mind, but I think it is so crucial to make life better in the city and as a model for scaling sort of that go-to-market strategy. So I think it's a great mission. We'd love to connect over a piece of cheese and learn more.
Okay, just one more thing on that, Grace. Since you are actually looking to do something in Los Angeles, do you want to say something about your experience?
Oh, I can say a lot about our lack of democracy here in the city of Los Angeles specifically.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Grace Yu. I'm a candidate for LA City Council as well as member of Civicas. Did you know that in the city of LA County voter registration somehow makes clerical errors that impact voters of certain ethnic communities? And it's happened more than once. In a span of 5 years, it's happened 3 times. So you have to wonder if it's truly democracy. But I know, I'll get to another question. When it comes down to AI helping with verifying signatures or just anybody doing signatures, what about our older adults? You know, the driver's license is like 10, 15 years old. You've had a stroke, you've gotten older. How can we verify this? Is there some other new topic going on in this world?
I'll answer that, and then I'll also try to speak about like kind of doing and funding like democracy reform work in California as well. It's a big passion of mine to get people more excited about it actually. On the signature verification, you're right, it's a huge problem for older Americans. It's also a huge problem for young people, many of whom like are just not, like they don't know how to write in cursive. Like my daughter, she's 8, or actually she just turned 9. One time she told me, she was like, that's not your signature, that's just your name in cursive. I was like, that's what that is, right? It really is a challenge for people. And then there's often, you know, signature matching, especially if it's automated, can really become a problem for immigrants because, you know, what's your first name and what's your last name might be like sort of get reversed a lot, and so what you've signed, you know, when you got your driver's license might be different from how you're used to signing it day to day. So it's a huge issue, and that's why we advocate for a best practice in jurisdictions that do use signature matching. There has to be a notice and cure process that's quite lengthy so that voters can be told, hey, we got an absentee ballot, the signature didn't match, we had a human check it, we didn't just like allow the machine to tell us it didn't match, we still think it doesn't match, you know, was this you? And like give people an opportunity to fix that problem. The election officials I talk to all over the country just say it's absolutely important to be able to do that because people often, like, you know, spouses will mix up each other's envelopes and then the signatures don't match when they go through the thing. If you want to actually have election security and enforce these verification requirements, you need to narrow it down to cases where there's actually some real concern that something improper might have happened, which are a very small number of cases, right? And so it's all of that best practice of allowing people to cure signatures that's what we advocate for. But I really appreciate your question because in the long run, it is becoming, there's more and more people whose signatures don't like pass that first test as we go on, as young people don't know how to write in cursive, we have an aging population. It's really, it is something that it's a form of verification that I think is kind of becoming less and less useful, honestly. But going back to that broader question about democracy reform in California, I can really say, because I do work nationally and a lot of the state advocacy I do tends to be in like other parts of the country, like Georgia and things like that, I can really say that the future really does come to California first when it comes to innovation and improvements in democracy. There's so many cases of good practices that we have here in California that have been frankly like refined and made better here in California that can then be promoted in other states when it comes to, you know, vote center models, all of these things, automatic voter registration. And I actually had an experience with that, which is that after there was this rise in threats to election workers after 2020, we really wanted to promote expanding address confidentiality programs to cover election officials and election workers. So these are programs that a lot of states have that were originally created to protect domestic violence survivors, where you can get your home address and other personal information redacted from all public records, including the public voter file, but still be able to register to vote, right, and exercise your rights. We really wanted to advocate for expanding those programs to cover election workers, and we advocated for that in California first, because I knew that we could probably not only get it passed here with an urgency clause that would allow it to go into effect right away, we could probably get some Republican members in the Assembly and the Senate to vote for it here, and then we could go to other places and say, this is a bipartisan issue, right? Like safety, this should not be politicized. And we did that. We got it passed in California, and then multiple other states have adopted that, have expanded their address confidentiality programs to cover election workers, and even in 2023, Oklahoma did it, right? Like, so Republican legislature, Republican governor, everything, and we didn't even advocate for that there. I found out they did it. I was like, awesome, they copied California. So I really do think that if anyone needs convincing that sort of improving democracy and making it better here is going to have impacts elsewhere, I think I'm here to help convince.
Hi, Deborah Kaufman. This has been a really interesting conversation. I love the idea of increasing the civic engagement between red and blue. My concern and my question is, what about the huge masses of people who are completely unengaged from the voting process? We have a really dismal record of people, how many percentage of people who vote in presidential, even contested presidential elections, and even worse turnout for state and local. Can we really call ourselves a democracy if half of the population is so distrustful of democratic institutions and so disengaged from policy that they don't even bother to show up to vote? What's the solution for that?
Again, no solution. And this isn't new, Deborah. I think that what's interesting is that our population has grown as largely as it has. Where are we, 300 million folks in the United States of America today, that we are attempting to get involved in a political process to utilize their voice such that they have impact on the system that's supposed to represent them. And it's always been this way. The work has always been, how do we support folks in seeing themselves as a part of democracy? What are the ways that we support people in showing up to be able to actually utilize their voice and be able to test, laboratory, whether or not something's going to happen? And so I think that there, again, as I think about the work of PACE and like the funders give the money to the people doing the work, is there's an opportunity here for us to ensure that part of the strategy of giving is around getting folks engaged. How do we shift the way that people see themselves? Do I see myself as which parts of my identity first? Black, woman, American, Democrat, mother? Like what actually, and where are there opportunities to utilize the different elements of that to get folks engaged in the things that are going to be impacting their communities, their families, their lives? But I think that that work is happening. There are organizations who are a part of our membership that are giving around civic education. There are organizations that are part of our membership that are giving around voter registration in particular, around mis and disinformation, around state and local policy. So I think that the work is happening, and perhaps the opportunity that exists here, coming back to our friends that were talking to us about journalism earlier, is how do we talk about it more? Where's there an opportunity for us to share the wins such that people see that when I do attempt to engage in this way, it matters?
Thank you so much. I was hoping that we could wrap up with one or two action items from each of you, just based on the conversation that we've had and things that we can really take home with us and share with others and go forward. I'll start with Joy. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna start with Dan.
Great, new plan. So I think we were supposed to do this from like the sector we're representing.
From the sector you're representing.
For businesses, I think there are a bunch of things. I think, especially as we look at the election coming up, giving employees or if you work somewhere, encouraging whoever makes this decision to give employees time off to vote. There's a great group based here in Los Angeles called Civic Alliance that's doing it. We work with another group called Day 4 Democracy that's doing this. That makes a huge difference. I think going back to Deborah's point, not just vote though, right? A lot of these places are saying giving you time off to poll work, giving you time off to give rides to the polls, volunteer, right? I think one answer to Deborah's really hard question is we have to broaden the definition of what it means to citizen. So it's not just voting, it's getting involved, it's volunteering, it's going to town halls, things like that. So I think that's one very concrete thing businesses can do. And I think the other thing is, as you're a business leader, especially as we try to make that distinction between democracy and politics, or football games and football rules, or rugby, squash games, whatever. Especially for things that can be more see-through, like lean into your voice as business, right? Like use that argument. I think there's such a fear now because nobody wants to be the next Disney or Bud Light or Target or whatever. But I think there is space, and even safe spaces, for businesses to come out and say civic engagement matters, right? Talking to your neighbors matters. The rules of the game matter. So I think businesses should both look at their employees and serve their communications in this, the most existential of all years, and saying these things matter, and business does have a stake in this, because we need the foundations of democracy for businesses to thrive. So it's not just altruistic, it's recognizing this is your self-interest and then acting accordingly.
I wrote down my action items, so I have to fill them up. So I'm glad Dan went first. So one thing that I think is an action item for folks is that I think really supporting research on disinformation and how to combat it is so crucial to democracy. As I was mentioning earlier, the folks who do this work have really been attacked. I mean, they've had lawsuits filed against them alleging that they are violating the Klan Act because they have engaged in a proactive effort to make sure that they're researching disinformation in languages other than English, right? I mean, it's like the most preposterous thing you could imagine. So I think supporting that kind of work is really important. Another kind of action item, I think, for everyone is to just be a really responsible information consumer and sharer of information. I think just being aware that, there's hate and racism and nativism getting pushed alongside all these election falsehoods is something that it's important for, business and community and religious leaders to really call out when that is happening, call out intimidation, that sort of speech, and be a kind of, responsible participant in all of that. And then the last big action item I can think of is really supporting election workers and local election officials. They're huge heroes in all of this. The vast majority are, just really believe in doing their job in the most nonpartisan and fair way possible to make sure every eligible voter can vote as easily as possible. And they are just massively underfunded and under-resourced. So I think support for them and support for budgets and funding for them and that sort of activity is really important.
I've got two. I think that one thing that I would encourage philanthropy to engage in is the opportunity to expand the reach of your giving portfolio. If you are a funder that focuses in on particular areas, is there a way for you to include a democracy initiative in that area? If you're an ed funder, education is democracy. Is there space for you to experiment with broadening the scope of where you're giving to have a broader impact on democracy? And I think that the second is wrapped up in the idea, Deborah, that democracy is aspirational and has been. How do we experiment with giving in a way that is bigger than what we are used to or have done in the past to be able to achieve something larger than what we have done so far? And PACE is having an event in December in Washington, D.C. Rick, I hope to see you there, whereby we hope to process the election and give funders the space to make decisions about how to continue making democracy larger than politics in 2025 and beyond, because the work that we're doing doesn't stop in November.
So with that, I just want to thank everybody, really, again, this is exactly what we hoped, right, Laura?
Absolutely.
And I want to thank everybody at Otis for helping so much, Renee and Nicole and my husband in Absentia. And if anybody is interested in learning more about Otis and coming to visit, you know, talk to Renee and we'll invite you to some things because it's a really amazing place. And Civicas is really proud to do things like this on an annual basis. We've been putting together these forums and we do it without cost because we are supported by membership. And I want to thank Mark for your generous contribution recently. Thank you so much because, you know, the idea of bringing together these cross-sector leaders to say what I think, you know, everybody has learned something today. And you all know what you know, but you don't all necessarily know what each other knows. And the same goes for everybody else in the room, and that's true for so many civic topics. So the best way to move things forward, we realize with Civicas, is to try and bring these cross-sector leaders together to be able to share their information and talk about how we can have more impact. And also on our website, so many of the organizations that you mentioned, and you know, like 50 more, are, we have a whole democracy, strengthening democracy resource page with all of these resources and links to them and a little description about them. So keep sending those and look at it and you can learn a lot about all those organizations. Everybody that is here that I've known about it, we've added to it and I've taken notes on some more of them, so please add some more. We'll also have a video of this so that you can share it with people and people who weren't able to be here. And we'll put some of your action items on it. And I just really want to thank everybody for coming out today and have a little reception. And now you know a little bit more about the other people in the room if you want to continue the conversation.